Hello, in this video, I'm going to give a brief introduction to blood. So in the picture here, you probably already guessed you're looking at blood, but it's not typically what we would think of when we think of as blood. We think of blood as this red liquid. This is a histological slide of blood. So this is what blood would look like when you looked at it under a microscope. So we're going to talk about the different components to blood and the different functions of blood. But first, what organ system does blood belong to? Does it belong to the circulatory system? Does it belong to the cardiovascular system? So we need to know what those two terms mean first. Circulatory system refers to the heart, blood vessels, and blood, whereas the cardiovascular system refers to just the heart, cardio, and blood vessels, vascular. So technically blood belongs to the circulatory system. However, most people use the term circulatory system and cardiovascular system interchangeably. Hematology is the study of blood. So basically in these next few slides, we are going to be looking at the various aspects of blood that we have discovered through the process of hematology. So first, let's start with the functions of blood. We can break blood functions down into three different things: transportation, regulation, and protection. So one of the main jobs of blood, obviously, is transportation. So blood is going to be used to transport gases like oxygen and carbon dioxide, but it's also there to transport nutrients and wastes. Another function of blood is regulation. So blood is used to regulate body temperature and pH. So body temperature, the role of blood there really involves our blood vessels too, because what happens like when we get really warm, when we get hot and our body temperature has gone up inside, we don't want to keep that heat inside our body. So our blood vessels will dilate, they get bigger, especially those in our skin, and that brings our hot blood closer to the surface of our skin so that the heat can leave our body. When we're cold, the opposite happens. Our blood vessels constrict, getting closer to the center of our body to hold in any warmth towards the center of the body. Blood is also important for regulating pH. So pH is ultimately looking at how acidic or how basic blood is. And there are things called buffers in our blood that help to maintain the pH of our blood despite any changes in the acid-base content. And the last function of blood is protection. Blood can protect us from both pathogens and from bleeding to death, right? So we have cells in our blood called white blood cells that have the main job of defending us against foreign invaders like bacteria and viruses, and even against our own cells when they go awry, like cancer cells. We have another type of cell in our blood called a platelet, and platelets help with the process of blood clotting, which is something that has to happen when we cut a blood vessel open so that we don't bleed to death. All right, now let's take a look at the physical characteristics of blood. So temperature is actually kind of odd for blood because most people would be like, oh, it's the same as your body temperature, but it's not. It's actually a little bit higher. So a typical blood temperature is going to be around 100 degrees Fahrenheit as compared to a body temperature of 98.6. Blood viscosity is referring to how thick blood is. So think of like water and then honey. They're both liquids, but one's thicker than the other, right? So honey is more viscous than water. So blood has a viscosity that's about 5 times higher than that of water. So it's not honey thick, but it's not just like water thin either. The pH of blood differs depending upon where we look. So when we look at the pH of blood in our veins, it's around 7.35, but the pH in our arteries is around 7.4. So don't forget that pH goes on a scale from 0 to 14. 0 is acidic, 14 is basic, 7 is right in the middle and it's neutral. So if artery pH is 7.4 and vein is 7.35, then you can see that in both cases we're slightly more basic than neutral. In terms of blood quantity, the average quantity of blood in the human being is around 5 liters or 5,000 milliliters. But obviously this is different based on body size. So men, for example, tend to be bigger than women, so they have more blood. So the bigger your body, the more blood you're going to have. odd sort of fact is that you can live with about half of your blood volume lost. So you can, if you were running at about 5 liters of blood on average, you get down to that 2.5, that's when you're going to be in trouble. All right, last bit is color. Blood color. This is a point of confusion for students. All blood is red, whether it's blood in your veins or blood in your arteries. All blood is red because inside of blood, we have a type of cell called a red blood cell. Inside of the red blood cell is a protein called hemoglobin. Inside of the protein hemoglobin is iron, and iron is red. Now, the iron has the job of transporting oxygen in our body. And when the iron is bound to oxygen, it tends to be this brighter, lighter kind of red. But when the oxygen leaves the iron changes color a little bit and it becomes like a duskier, deeper sort of red. But in both cases, it's always red. In textbooks and in images, you will see like red and blue blood vessels. That color is there to denote a symbolic status of oxygen in the blood. So they use red to denote high oxygen and blue to denote lower oxygen. So it's not like blood is actually red and blue, right? And some people will say, well, how about, people with light skin, you can see blue veins in their wrist and things like that. So that's actually, you can think of it as like a optical illusion in a way. It's not really an illusion, but it's just optics. It's the way the light is bouncing off the surface of the blood vessel. If I were to cut open my vein and show it to you, and sorry, I'm not going to do that, but if I were to do that, you would see that indeed the blood inside of there is red. All right, now let's look at the major components to blood. So blood is a tissue. Tissues by definition are composed of cells and then the fluid outside of the cell. So the cells of blood are called formed elements. It's this weird old-fashioned term that's just kind of stuck, but formed elements in cells refers to the same thing. The other part of blood would be the fluid outside of the cells, which is referred to as plasma. The majority of blood is actually plasma. The average amount of plasma is around 55%, whereas the average amount of formed elements is around 45%. So a little over half of your blood is going to be the plasma, the stuff outside of the cells, and a little less than half of your blood is actually the cells. So the plasma is a really important part to blood. So I gave you the percentages of 55 and 45, and that's a good ballpark estimate, but the tactical percentages are listed here on the slide. So about 46 to 63% of your blood is plasma. Most of that is water, but it also contains proteins and other dissolved solutes like glucose and ions. The formed elements of blood make up 37 to 54% of the total blood volume. And you have 3 types of formed elements: erythrocytes, also known as red blood cells, leukocytes, also known as white blood cells, and platelets. In the picture here, we see a tube with blood in it. And what has happened is someone has taken this tube of blood and they put it in a centrifuge, which spins around real fast, and it causes the heavy things in the tube to go to the bottom. So the heavy stuff in blood is the cells. So that bottom red layer are the red blood cells. And then you kind of see a lighter, whiter layer, real small, just above the red blood cells. And those are the leukocytes, white blood cells, and platelets. And then on top of that is sort of this yellow layer, and that's the plasma. So just looking at this centrifuge tube, you can see how a little over half of it is plasma and a little under half is going to be the formed elements. And you can see how most of the formed elements are those red blood cells. The other picture we see here is a blood smear, a histological slide of blood that's been stained. So the white blood cells don't look like much if you don't add stain to them. They're called white blood cells, by the way, because when we look at the centrifuge tube, we see that white layer above the red blood cells, and that's why they're called white blood cells. But on this blood smear, we can see that we have lots of those red circles all over the place. Those are the erythrocytes. The blue and purple larger blobs, those are the leukocytes. And if you look closely, you'll see little purple dots here and there, and those are the platelets. But the white background is ultimately what we would call our blood plasma. All right, let's take a closer look at blood plasma. So most of blood plasma is water, about 92%. The remaining 8% is 7% proteins and then 1% other solutes. So I want to talk about what the word solute means real quick. So a solute is a substance that dissolves in a solvent, right? So in biology, almost all the time, the solvent is water, right? So solutes are substances that dissolve in water. So as I mentioned previously, about 7% of our blood plasma is protein. Most of the proteins in blood plasma are made by the liver, and probably the most important blood plasma protein is something called albumin. So albumin makes up the majority of the protein inside of our blood plasma. Albumin is really important for osmotic balance. So osmosis is the diffusion of water across the semi-permeable membrane, and water always diffuses towards the higher solute concentration. So in the picture here at the bottom of the screen, we can see a beaker of water, and that red dashed line is supposed to be a semi-permeable membrane. Right? And the little purple dots are solutes dissolved in the water. The water, I guess, is pink in this picture, right? And you can see how there's a difference between the two images, right? Here, the water level's the same, right? Higher solute over here, lower solute over here. But over here, given time, the water has moved to the side with the higher solutes. So that is osmosis. It's the process of water moving towards the higher solute concentration. Albumin acts as a solute in our blood plasma, and it will be really important when it comes to exchanging water in the body. Another type of protein we find in blood plasma are globulins. Globulins include the immunoglobulins, which are better known as antibodies and help us to defend against foreign invaders. And another type of globulin are going to be transport globulins. So these are proteins in the blood plasma that help to transport another substance. So we have globulins, for example, that can transport hormones like thyroid hormone throughout our blood. Fibrinogen is another important protein in blood plasma. Fibrinogen is the inactive form of the protein fibrin. So basically, fibrinogen gets a little chop that happens to it and it becomes fibrin. And this occurs when we need blood clotting to happen because fibrin is an important part to blood clotting. Other proteins that we find in blood plasma include enzymes. So enzymes are things that are going to speed up chemical reactions. And hormones. So not all hormones are made out of protein, but some hormones are made out of protein. And these are actually found in the blood plasma. So an example of this could be insulin, right? So insulin is a hormone that travels through the bloodstream. It's released by the pancreas, but it needs to go to all the cells of the body and tell your cells to take glucose out of the blood and bring it into themselves. So 1% of our blood plasma is this other solutes category. This includes inorganic substances. So these are substances that lack carbon and hydrogen. Most of these are electrolytes or minerals like sodium, potassium, magnesium, calcium, those types of things. Also in the other solute category are organic nutrients like glucose or fats or certain types of vitamins. And then organic waste like urea. Urea is an organic waste that we produce when we use proteins for energy. Also in the other solute category are going to be gases. So some gases are going into our red blood cells, but some of the gases are going to dissolve right in our blood plasma. So like oxygen, carbon dioxide, and nitrogen gases do dissolve right in our blood plasma. Something I wanted to mention, we'll talk more about in a different video, is the fact that when carbon dioxide dissolves in our blood plasma, it doesn't stay as the carbon dioxide gas because carbon dioxide is pretty reactive and it will react actually with the water in our blood plasma. And when this occurs, it forms a new substance called carbonic acid. And carbonic acid is what we call a weak acid. It readily breaks down into its two components, which are hydrogen ions and bicarbonate ions. And the bicarbonate ions are a very important buffer in our blood plasma. So these buffers are things that can take in or release hydrogen ions as necessary in order to maintain a stable pH. So don't forget, pH is really the measure of the hydrogen ion concentration of a solution. If hydrogen ions get too high, things become acidic. If hydrogen ions get too low, things become too basic. So buffers are there in order to take in or release the hydrogen ions to maintain a specific pH. The last part of this video is looking at the formed elements in just a little bit more detail. So as I mentioned previously, 37 to 54% of your blood plasma is going to be the formed elements. 99.9% of that is going to be the erythrocytes or red blood cells, which have the main job of carrying oxygen. The remaining 0.1% is going to be made up of both leukocytes, white blood cells, and platelets, which are also known as thrombocytes. When it comes to the leukocytes, there are different varieties of leukocytes, and some of these even have subcategories to them. But the 5 basic types of leukocytes are lymphocytes, which include our cells that defend us against specific foreign invaders, eosinophils, basophils, neutrophils, and monocytes. The platelets, or thrombocytes, are going to be important for blood clotting. On this review slide, I have a few questions. So what I want you to do right now is to pause this video and answer these review questions. When you're ready, go to the next slide to test yourself to see if you got them right. Good luck.